Everyone, thank you so much for joining me tonight. We have myself and three other guests, so I'm super excited to talk with everyone tonight. The theme of this episode is keeping Christ in Christmas. I was actually just driving earlier, and of course, where I live, there are it feels like tons of bumper stickers with that "Keep Christ in Christmas" little slogan. So I'm excited to explore that with you all tonight. So I'll introduce myself real quick and then I'll pass it on to our other guests. So I'm Lana Hurst. I am the pastor of First Presbyterian Church and also the pastor of the Glenwood Table, which is this podcast. My pronouns are she, her. I am a trans woman and there's lots of ways I think about my Christianity. Sometimes I think of it as a Christian agnosticism in which I feel like the ways in which I have come to know this God is through the Christian tradition. And there's a lot that I'm willing to say I don't know and that I'm willing to be wrong about and be open about. And so I like asking questions and exploring. So I'm excited to do that with everyone here. Who would like to go next? Pastor Don, you're already unmuted. You want to go next?
And I forgot to hit my mute button. That gets me right there. All right. Well, I'm Don Van Antwerpen. I'm with the RCA. I am the pastor of Unfinished Community, which is kind of an experimental online church plant that is interdenominational. It's kind of a little bit of everything and is unique in that it exists only online rather than having a sanctuary. We have a Discord server. So it's kind of a little bit different and experimental and fun and more than a little insane, which is in keeping with me. For my own background and connection to Christianity, I grew up in the RCA initially, surrounded by all of your conservative folks in West Michigan. And my Christianity from then has evolved from a position of, wow, conservatism is what Christianity is, to a place of looking at all of the cishet white people around me who claim to be Christians going, seriously, guys? Seriously? Really? That was pretty much my journey there in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you. We're excited that you're with us. JJ, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am JJ Flag. I am currently a pastor in the United Church of Christ in Watertown, New York, and use he, him pronouns. And as far as my relationship to Christianity, it is pretty interesting. And you probably hear some yelling in the background. Those are my kids. For anybody who's listening to us, you're probably going to hear some of that as we go through this episode. So I apologize in advance. The way that I relate to Christianity, I think I've become a lot more comfortable over the last few months, maybe the last year or so, in identifying myself as a universalist Christian, and being very clear that universalist comes first as opposed to Christian, because I think the other way around supposes a supremacy over other faiths. And I don't necessarily believe that Christianity has a monopoly on the sacred or the divine. And so I've become a lot more open to naming that and being okay with it. And so that's kind of where I am.
Awesome. Thank you. The Reverend Dr. JJ Flag. All right.
Yes, you've got 4 reverends on this video chat.
Yes.
On this podcast episode. It's quite a crew. And all of us met at Princeton Theological Seminary. And I, Emmie, use she, her pronouns and have the privilege of working with Lana as her communications manager, and also a privilege of working as a chaplain in New York City, currently at a pediatric hospital, but curious to see where God will bring me next. My relationship to Christianity, like JJ, I also relate with the term universalist, but interestingly enough, I actually flipped the term to Christian universalist. And so I love that there is this diversity among us of how we understand our God to be all loving and all encompassing of all people of all religions and all non-religions. I work with a lot of kids who could not care less about religion, but have a sense of spirituality. And I care more about that than I do about any doctrines or dogma. But we are all here in this call because at some point we related enough to Christianity to be in seminary together. And for that, I thank God.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone. So I want to start here with this idea, keeping Christ in Christmas. So I certainly grew up hearing this phrase used in church and certainly seeing it on bumper stickers, even as I do now. I remember family members having brooches that had "Keep Christ in Christmas" or "Jesus is the reason for the season," that sort of thing. So I wonder for you all, when you hear this phrase, what images come to your mind or what experiences from your past? What did that mean to you like when you were younger?
I'll speak for myself on that one, if that's all right. I remember my first argument with my parents, actually, on this one. One of my first arguments with it. And, as you get out of a typical middle schooler, I remember them talking with a group of adults at church about how we need to keep the Christ in Christmas. And I just remember walking up to the group and saying, it's in the name. Like, and I never did get a good answer out of that, is how was Christ not in Christmas when literally, at least in American culture, it's in the name. It's the reason all of this holiday season is celebrated at that time. And even if we're making room for other faiths to participate, like, that doesn't mean we're not there. So like on multiple levels, I did not understand that. I got in a big old banger of a fight with my family over that one, because that's kind of what I do. But that led me into kind of a questioning state where I'm like, why are we getting hung up on that? Do we need to be so public about this thing? Why is it a big deal for us to make sure that everyone acknowledges this? And I've never gotten a good theological understanding of the need to do that.
So I grew up non-religious. And so the closest thing I had to this was, I would get, chocolate advent calendars that I would forget about starting on December 10th. And on December 24th, I'd had 15 pieces of candy to eat. That's about as, important all of that was to me. I grew up in a pretty non-religious area. There were a good number of Catholics, but nobody my age who was very into their faith. And so I don't really know if I even heard the phrase "keep Christ in Christmas" unless I was watching like a movie or a TV show. And I was just sort of like, oh, what a joke that all is. But I didn't really ever experience it. And then the folks that I went to college with, where I became a Christian, I felt like most of them were like modern enough evangelicals to know that they needed to look cool. And by saying "keep Christ in Christmas," they may sound like their parents. And so they needed to find some sort of other way of maintaining that, but nobody ever really said it. And so I've become more familiar with it through people's stories more than anything.
Mm.
That is I love that you use the wording. I've become more familiar with it through people's stories, because it says a lot about the weight of people's stories and how they like impact other folks, or how we come to understand the divine through the stories of other people. So that's pretty cool. I was thinking about my own experience having grown up in a predominantly Black, very theologically conservative Baptist church in South Florida. And there was this thing that we would do every year where Santa would come to the church and children would come together in the what they called the fellowship hall, and Santa would give gifts to all of these kids who had gathered there. And I remember every year that was something that we absolutely loved to do. It was this thing that as soon as it got a little bit chilly in South Florida, you knew the next thing that was going to happen was there was going to be a parade of gifts coming out of the fellowship hall. And then I remember one year it just stopped. And all the kids were kind of like, what the heck? You know, we had these awesome gifts that we'd go to church and get, like we'd get breakfast and they'd sing carols and then we'd get these gifts and then all of a sudden it disappeared. And I remember almost immediately after it disappeared, there was this workshop that had happened during a church service. And it was this entire workshop around how Santa was a cover-up for Satan. And I don't remember how the person came up with the logic, but I remember the letters being switched around and
that's the one.
And the person telling the congregation that like encouraging this idea of Santa was really pushing children towards Satan. And they ended their presentation by saying, we need to keep the Christ in Christmas. And I think I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I still remember that entire experience almost as if it were yesterday. So that was my first encounter with the phrase, keep Christ in Christmas.
What was your reaction in your heart? You were 8 or 9. And so how much of what they were selling did you buy?
Oh, I didn't buy any of it. I was very angry that like I felt like these adults were really gullible and stupid. Now, this is very ironic because here I am, you know, a kid who is completely like, I've bought into the idea that Santa should be, you know, allowed to bring us joy through gifts. Whether Santa was real or not, I don't even remember if I had tried to like wrestle through that in my head. But I really was mad at the fact that all of these adults were so gullible enough to buy into this person's presentation that was built around the whole idea of stealing joy from kids. Mm. So I just remember sticking with me and thinking, if I ever become a pastor, no idiot like this would be allowed to come in my church and give a presentation like this.
Well, I think at the core of that, we see something that I've kind of come to call the Salvation Army methodology, the discontinuation of a kindness because you want to push an agenda or a motive, which is a fundamentally anti-Christian thing to do, to stop doing a kind or nice thing because you want to convert people or because you want to protect your image or something like that. When you're in service of Jesus, whose whole thing was, I don't care what it looks like, I'm gonna help people, and you're doing that, that was the thing that always bugged me. And especially like in your case, JJ, you're talking about a whole generation worth of kids who have come to associate church with the people who stopped the happy from happening. Mm. And, you know, we look at it in the case of these kids here, but we do this all the time in conservative branches of the church. And it's just like, I don't care if it's nice or if it's fun or if it's good or if it's helping people. If it doesn't look like my idea of what Christianity should look like, we're not going to do it. And that is just hurtful and wrong. And it drives me up a wall.
So you all are much better people than I am, because I totally bought into keep Christ in Christmas. I mean, I remember being so proud to see my family member who had the Jesus is the reason for the season pen. And I was like, I need one of those, you know, like I remember so at some point I was going to a church that did something similar to what JJ just described. They did, well, I remember there was a conference that they did that was about music, and it was basically about how, and it was around Christmas time, and it was about how like all music that's not Christian music is satanic. And we shouldn't listen to any of it. So they were like telling us to like throw out all of our CDs, like the whole shebang. And I remember my parents didn't go to church. Like I was going to church with my friend, and I was so conflicted about listening to Christmas music that year, like secular Christmas music, because I was like, oh my God, this isn't about Jesus. And like, what do we do? I don't know. And I remember my pastor called me while we were making Christmas cookies at home, and the Christmas music was blaring. And so I'm like trying to run away from the Christmas music to answer the phone. But like when I went to college, I went to, a Pentecostal school. And even there, I feel like I became even more radical, which for me was certainly like I felt like there was a war on Christmas, that like Santa was a way of preventing kids from seeing the real reason for Christmas. Like I bought wholesale into all of that. And I was like, I was certain I was not going to tell my kids about Santa. And I was going to make sure that my kids knew the real reason for Christmas. And, it was like, I don't know, for me, there was like this great war, this spiritual battle that we were fighting. It was a way of finding like some meaning and excitement and quelling my own inner anxiety by focusing on this other thing. But yeah. So for me at the time, keeping Christ in Christmas was really all about like we needed people to know that Christmas was about Jesus coming to save them. And if we didn't let them know, then they were going to die and go to hell. What were you going to say, Don?
No, I was saying I got a lot of that too. Like I grew up in, like I said, super conservative West Michigan, Whitey McWhitertown right there. It's about as, we called it the Northern Bible Belt, not, inappropriately. And I remember that same feeling, man, growing up, just like, oh, it's exciting. There's a war on Christmas. We got to fight back against the culture. And then the Left Behind books came out and we all became premillennial dispensationalists. And then it just went downhill from there. But like that desire to be part of something, some big, great cosmic struggle motivates a lot of this, which is kind of annoying when there really isn't a struggle going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what you just said really highlights that there's this need for belonging, right? And this is a way to feel like we belong to something much larger than ourselves, but it becomes this fabricated struggle.
It's interesting that we're taking that turn, because even though I had this experience as a young kid, it would happen that in my young adulthood, I became one of those people who was like, this is a war on Christmas. Nobody wants to say Merry Christmas. Everybody's saying Happy Holidays. Damn it, it's Merry Christmas. And I remember being like righteously angry because people did not want to say Merry Christmas. I don't know where the hell that came from, but I suspect that it was because I wanted to belong so badly in the spaces that I was in, being surrounded by white evangelical conservative Christians and being this person who is embodied the way that I am and sticking out like a sore thumb. I had to in some way buy into something that was being preached. And so if it meant, that I was going to be a part of the onward Christian soldiers, hey, so be it. Now I look back at that and I kind of cringe, but like, I think this idea of buying into this for the sake of belonging actually plays a huge part in why so many people have fallen hook, line, and sinker into this notion of a war on Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you don't mind me tossing something out truly terrifying here, along with a shameless plug, my own community talked about this a little while back in one of our podcast episodes when we were talking about what turns your standard cishet white male Christians into white supremacists and Nazis. And it's really the same idea, that frustrated sense of belonging.
Yeah. Belonging is huge. I mean, we're biologically, neurologically, psychologically, spiritually wired for belonging. Emmie, were you going to say something?
Yes, sorry. For a moment, I was just focused on like future sound editing. For y'all who don't know, I had never edited a podcast before I started doing this, and I'm still getting my feet under. But I think the way we've been describing it in the last few minutes actually sounds like very much sort of like that gentle slide into QAnon of like I want to be part of something bigger. People don't understand. There's like a nefarious force out there that's making it so that the goodness cannot happen. And so it just, I don't know, it reminds me of the reason that so many conservative Christians have at least one or two beliefs that QAnon propagates. It sounds very similar to that, like longing to understand a world that is inherently sort of incomprehensible sometimes, and a longing to belong, especially when we're being told to stay home or stay 6 feet apart or wear masks or whatever it is that people feel is just too much to handle or take on for the good of their neighbor.
Oh, I gotta draw attention to this because I just love the historical parallel here that I'm seeing. And admittedly, the historian in me is getting a laugh at this, but this desire for belonging into a close community that has access to secret knowledge that makes them spiritually better than other. God, we've been here before, haven't we? This sounds incredibly like Gnosticism.
I think there's a flip side to this though, that we haven't touched on yet. And I would say, I'm a bit hesitant to say this, but I think that there is some good that can emerge out of keeping Christ in Christmas. If we were to take the story of Christmas in context.
Yes.
And that then removes us away from the capitalistic bend that we've kind of contorted Christmas into. It also removes the idea of oh my gosh, I cannot remember the word, but this anti-immigrant sentiment that we see rising in certain parts of the US. Like, I just find it so interesting that so many Christians even today are running around saying, keep Christ in Christmas, and yet you are in the same breath still in some way, shape, or form leaning into a sentiment of build the wall. We don't hear those words as much now, but I wonder if we really bought into this idea of keeping Christ in Christmas, how that would sway the way we approach politics and faith and so many other things.
Well, when we ask the question, when we run into someone who keep the Christ in Christmas, ask them the question, which one? Because I bet they're thinking about white Jesus.
This was my secret agenda for this episode, JJ. So I'm so excited to talk about how we view Christmas now as adults, as people who had varying experiences growing up of Advent or Christmas, or Advent and Christmas, depending on what tradition we came from, and whether they sort of observed that liturgical season of waiting and of patience. How do you see the Christmas story now as an adult?
So I'll tell you, the way that I understand the Christmas story now is very different from anything that I had heard preached or kind of presented to me as a kid. I remember when I first got to my current congregation, we were having a meeting of the worship team, and they were asking me, Pastor JJ, what are your plans for Christmas Eve service? Because I was new and they were concerned that I wouldn't fall in line with tradition. And I said, well, I'm thinking about preaching a sermon that Jesus meets us in the shittiness of life. And there was so much like pearl clutching. People were like, don't, we think you could preach that, but say it differently. And I was thinking, but like that is at the core what the Christmas story is about. The fact that this divine being comes and meets us in the messiness of who we are and where we are. I mean, the songs that we sing, like Silent Night, right? There was nothing silent about that night. If we read the story, there was a lot of hustle and bustle going on. Mary gives birth in a barn, and then Jesus lies in a horse trough. There's nothing silent, clean, or lovely about any of that. And so what does that say about God incarnate meeting us where we are? That's really what I would love people to hear when we talk about the Christmas story. So that's kind of like, I have my own agenda trying to get that point across, that if we're going to hold on to the Christmas story, let's really hold on to the messiness of it.
Yeah, I similarly got in trouble with my first Christmas Eve sermon in my congregation, very, very similar way. For me, my focus was on the human conflict inherent in the situation, where you've got, Mary and Joseph coming to the town from which their family is from, and not staying with family, looking for room at the inn, not finding room at the inn, and having to crash in a barn. The sheer amount of isolation and human conflict that's happening in that place says a lot about the brutality that humans can heap upon each other relationally. And particularly in churches right now, as those of you who know me know, it's kind of a stick I got up my backside on this one. That brutality of relationships that we have with each other that manifests in church more than anywhere else. Our ability to pick on someone we don't like, that we don't agree with, push them aside, cast them out, expel the heathen from amidst us, or whatever the heck you feel like calling it today. We do that, and that same indignity and that same suffering in the midst of all of the other stuff that you talk about, JJ, was heaped upon Jesus and his parents in the moment of his birth. And when we try to talk about Christ being in Christmas, we try to kind of sanitize it and rub our sanitary wipes all over it and make it all nice and pristine and fancy pants Leonardo da Vinci white Jesus doing his thing. But in the end, this is a unwed teen mother screaming it out in a stable, surrounded by family members who aren't there and should be. And that is simultaneously brutal and sad. And that is where God chose to connect with humanity. That God didn't choose, the kingly halls or the moments of comfort or those, hallmark moments between people that we, love to see in all of our Christmas movies. God didn't choose to any of those sorts of places to connect with humanity. It was all about being in those worst kind of moments and to share that experience with us. And that, you can't have Christmas without that.
Yeah, so I think for me, something that comes up is the question of who and or what is the Christ. And so for me, I approach it certainly through more of a Richard Rohr universal Christ kind of way. So if you haven't checked out or know Richard Rohr, I encourage anyone who's listening, just Google the universal Christ, Richard Rohr. There's a podcast, there's books, there's short readings. You can look at lots of things. But essentially for me, what this means is that the Christ is a great mystery that is not simply found in Jesus, but certainly embodied in Jesus, but embodied in everything, that the Christ is all in all. And that this sense in which, so the Christ, I would define more as this sense of spirit and matter, right? Spirit and the physical, that we find God incarnate in all places, so I would be a panentheist, meaning God is in all things, all places, all people. And so the sad thing is, though, all of us have a lot of shit that God gets buried under within us, and we have to uncover that, right? like part of our task is to allow the Spirit to shine through everything, right? In spite of all of the things that happen to us and the things that we do that cause harm. But I think so for me, one of the ways that I really think about keeping Christ in Christmas is Mary's Magnificat, is this song, right? Mary's song that she sings in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 1, starting I think at verse 46, after she has had Gabriel the messenger come to her. He's told her that she's going to be pregnant. She goes and visits Elizabeth, and even her cousin Elizabeth knows that Mary is carrying within her this Christ child, this very sacred manifestation of God in the world, in the physical. And Mary then sings this song that's really about turning the spotlight off of herself and her son even onto God and what God is doing in the world through this moment, through her and through this Christ child, which is a great reversal of all things. It is the turning upside down of the world, of the systems that we know. And I think for me, then, I think of keeping Christ in Christmas as a great revolution, as something that is about saying, where are the ways in the world that we have created suffering? I think the reality is we cannot remove suffering from the world entirely, but we can reduce harm, we can reduce suffering, and we can create greater equity. We can create more goodness in the world. And goodness is not a pie that you can empty, right? Love and compassion and empathy are not pies that you can empty. They are infinite. The more love that you give, the more love that's created, right? That these things go on and on. And so I think for me, keeping Christ in Christmas is being able to lean into that mystery. Where do we find this sacredness within us, among us? This reality as we wait in Advent for Christ to come is to discern where Christ has come already in our midst. Where is Christ here now? Where am I seeing this mystery? And where am I being invited to participate in the great reversal of all things, where there is equity, where there is justice, where there is a new world, right? And I think, I've often, and this came up in my conversation with Emmie on Wednesday, I've often thought about this reversal as being largely about like systems that we can that are more tangible, right? Like mass incarceration or like Trans Day of Remembrance with the death of trans people, right? Like things that we can actually see. But I think it's not just things that we can see, it's a reversal of things we can't see. Like the love that we like feel towards someone. What if we reverse the way that we thought about people, the invisible thoughts, right? What if the great reversal starts as an inner witness to the Christ, an inner spirituality, or not necessarily even has to start, right? I think both the doing and the feeling and thinking are all connected psychologically. But what if it's also about a reversal within us just as much as the reversal around us?
If I'll run the risk of a somewhat non sequitur here to that, talking about those reversals, one of the things I love to get at, particularly with biblical literalists here, is you want to talk about reversals, talk about the strength of Mary in the beginning of this story here. I mean, we love to look at her exposure to the messenger of God and then be like, okay, and then going on as this kind of sanitized sort of thing. But if you take your more literal understanding of the Bible, what basically happened is Mary was chilling out as an unwed teen, and then this Lovecraftian horror emerged into her life and said, boom, you're pregnant, and then noped out like Skeletor. Like, she's got to be freaking out at that. I mean, angels aren't these like little winged babies. They're supposed to be these kind of monstrous sort of eyes and wings and all this sort of stuff, if you take a literalist approach. But even setting that aside, that's a big emergence of a divine fracturing of what's normal in reality here. That's telling her, hey, here's the thing that sucks. You got this right now, and all of the social crap that's coming with it. And our next move is to sing the Magnificat, right? It's not to like look around and go, what the unholy was that? You don't get any of that. You get the strength of a woman who's like, all right, this is a thing now. we're going to do the thing, which is a type of strength that, particularly in a time and context where women were seen as these weak little pieces of property that men could collect like Pokemon cards, it's outstanding. It is an amazing reversal of the norm, and it creates a situation where the entirety of our Christian existence is riding on the backs of a woman who was given the impossible and said, you know what, I got this. And I think that is truly one of the most magnificent points of that story, no pun intended.
So I just want to jump back to something Lana said, because you painted such a beautiful picture of everything that happens in that barn. Number one, you've given me a door into a Christmas Eve sermon, so thank you very much.
You gotta share that with me though.
Well, I will. So while you were talking, I was thinking about the Chronicles of Narnia and how this door opens up to another world. And I wonder if we've been missing the significance of the innkeeper in opening the door to the Holy Family, so that they might show us what it looks like to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed and often marginalized. And then there's the point that Don made. All of this happens, and then Mary turns around and sings a song. And that really says a lot to me about people who are oppressed and the way music is used as a tool of liberation in the midst of their oppression. And so I'm just kind of sitting with those things and relishing in them as a preacher. And I'm really interested to see how they take shape for Christmas Eve. But I want to thank you all in advance for making my job a little bit easier.
Praise be to God. Everything that y'all said has reminded me of the words of one of my favorite artists and poets, Jan Richardson, who I think entitles her work A Painted Prayer Book. And she, when commenting on the Magnificat, says that Mary remembers forward because she is speaking a world that does not yet exist. You know, she is sitting there in the midst of all these things, overwhelmed, just living in a time when empire is crushing the average person. And she says, the hungry are filled, are present tense. And, you know, I saw this in the NICU at my hospital. One of the mamas I work with had put a tiny piece of paper next to her daughter that said 100% healed and 100% redeemed. And, you know, as someone who is like very curious about like the presence of miracles in hospitals and what it means for God to intervene, I was, you know, at first I thought that was kind of like awkward and foolish, right? Her daughter was like 2 pounds and like very much in trouble. But then it reminded me of the Magnificat and remembering forward of like, she is living and remembering forward a time when her daughter will be healthier than she is right now, a time when the world will be more just than it is right now, a time when ... the hungry are filled. And so I like the idea of sort of like invitation into the Christmas story rather than just watching from afar and being like, well, that sounds like a hard night. Like, what an unfortunate place to give birth to a savior. And let's just look at the rest of his life. But most importantly, he came to die, right? That's like the classic line of like cross theology and like some very conservative environments, which I think takes so much away from Jesus's life, but also this one night in his life when around him all was going wrong, basically, and yet he comes and he's able to bring hope and peace and joy and love in the present. And we are called to be people of hope who live out as if we already have hope and joy and peace and love in ways that perhaps we don't yet have.
Lana, you probably know this televangelist, Rodney Howard Brown. He used to joke that Christians have an obsession with Jesus being born and killing him by the middle of the year, and by the end of the year, he's born all over again. And he would say that that we don't do much with the life of Jesus. We tend to focus more on his birth and his death. And so it's interesting that I'm even quoting Rodney Howard Brown, because he's one of those folks that would push, the keeping the Christ in Christmas ideology. But the reason why I brought that up, I think what's really interesting that we haven't touched on yet, but Emmie, you kind of alluded to it, is the sick and sadistic implication that God would bring God's beloved child into the world just for the sake of killing them, so that we all might have eternal life. I've always struggled with the way that we dance around that at Christmas time. The fact that we could be singing about this king who is supposed to be coming into the world and flipping our idea of what royalty is and what majesty is and all of those things, flipping them on its head, and then turn around and say, but he was born to die, and not bat an eye at it. And we just keep, saying it year after year after year. And I wonder, what is it within us, not all of us, but what is it within us, I guess, collectively across Christianity, that doesn't cause us to question saying things like that? We just kind of sing it because it sounds good, and we say it because it seems to make sense, and we've been taught it, and so we go with it. But why don't we push back on it?
I think for what it's worth, part of it has to do with our obsession with the whole penal substitutionary atonement theory. But it's, this intrinsic belief, particularly in, your average lay folk who come into this feeling that for everything there must be a punishment. And when you have invested yourself in a worldview that for all things there must be a consequence and a punishment, you have embraced a view that naturally leads to an assumption of the Christ child is born to die, but also you don't realize is also a worldview that has completely rejected the existence of grace. And so our humanity loves to dwell in that space where we're like, there must be punishment. And then that leaches into every other aspect of who we are and what we do. And we lose sight of the fact of what the story of Christ is actually about, which is the emergence of a new and transformative grace into the world. And in embracing the one, we tend to lose the other. And that, I think, is the great tragedy of how so many of us approach.
Perhaps Christ's coming is just grace. Perhaps Christmas can be summed up in the word grace. Of thanks for showing up here, of all places. Thank you for showing us in the flesh what it can be to be a people of mercy, to be a people of grace, to be a people who hangs out with prostitutes and tax collectors, and fill in whatever word you need to here in order to imagine feeling diametrically opposed to that group. Just thanks for being here.
But I wonder if at least for me, following this train of thought, I wonder if keeping the Christ in Christmas if we're trying to redeem that sentiment, right? I'm not saying that we are, but it's at least it's my goal to leave the conversation with something that can be redeemed out of what has been weaponized for so many years. I wonder if keeping the Christ in Christmas is this invitation to welcome grace to remain in the Christmas story, number one, and number two, to not see ourselves as diametrically opposed, but as in solidarity with, or the reality that I am no better than you are, simply because you are at a different station in life. I think that is the epitome of grace, realizing that we all are on level playing field. And I wonder if that really is what we should be getting out of the Christmas story. That in this story, we find all of ourselves somewhere in that barn on the night when Jesus was born. Mm-hmm. Whether it's in the innkeeper, or in Mary giving birth, or in Jesus being born into everything that he should not have been born into as someone who was royalty, whether it was the other folks who were trying to find a place in being obedient to the census, and them not being able to find a place, and just we're all somewhere present in that story. And so I wonder if this entire conversation is an invitation to find ourselves somewhere in the story.
Well, if I can piggyback on that a little bit, I love your idea of looking at this as an issue of solidarity. And I wonder if when we, and when I say we, I say that fully, cognizant of the fact that as, a cishet white, American male, that we is a fairly narrow category. We, the conservatives, we, the Americana who like to look at these things in these narrow ways. I wonder if when we approach the Christmas story, we tend to see ourselves as on Team Jesus automatically, and not as all of the other humans who looked at this thing and said, I don't understand it. Let's push it out to Egypt. Let's beat it down, and let's eventually kill it. And that can carry over to just about every other marginalized or oppressed fight we're having today, whether you're talking about trans rights, the LGBTQIA community, whether you're talking about racism in America. There is this mindset within that kind of conservative white Christianity that just says, I don't understand it, so I don't like it. Let's push it out. Let's send it to Egypt. Let's kick it out. Let's make it go away, and let's eventually kill it. And that is the exact same mindset that the majority that eventually led to the crucifixion approached Jesus and Jesus' ministry with. And so I see, at least I hope to see, in a way, embracing the Christmas story as a way for us to look at ourselves and say, are we the baddies sometimes, maybe? Are we actually on Team Jesus here, or would we be the ones that look at it, don't understand it, and kill it? Because that is a human tendency that we often embrace, far too often embrace, and that defines how we interact with our fellow human beings and the rest of the world, and is at the heart of the Jesus story here. And so there's a call to solidarity in that, but we also have to acknowledge that maybe our solidarity needs to switch sides here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the image that comes to my mind when you're both talking is we're building a bridge between our world and the text. And JJ, what I hear you saying, right, is that we walk into the world of our text and find ourselves in that world. And then, Don, what I hear you saying is we walk back into our world with what we've discovered there and find where that text is alive in us and where we might be in that text. And something else that is coming to my mind right now is I've been ruminating on, so for the Women's Lectionary by Will Gaffney, the readings this week are, the readings that I'm using of the four are the one is Sarah's blessing given to her, Abraham and Sarah. And then the other is when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. And it seems like such an inconsequential story that Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. I mean, of course, it's like, oh, yay, like Elizabeth recognizes Mary, the baby recognizes, the baby in Elizabeth's womb recognizes Mary and Jesus. But when you put it side by side with the Sarah story is coming on the heels last week of the Hagar story. And Sarah and Hagar are such an interesting, right? They parallel Elizabeth and Mary in so many ways, right? So Hagar is, she's an enslaved woman. She is less privileged than Sarah in many ways, right? Sarah is the wife of a man who was willing to give her over to be, used sexually against her will, right? Multiple times in the narrative. And so in that way, Sarah is still, under the oppression of the patriarchy, but she also abuses her own enslaved person, right? She abuses Hagar. And in one way that Hagar has a win over Sarah is her fertility, right? Hagar has something that Sarah can't get. And then when we look at Mary and Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth is also barren like Sarah. Elizabeth is the wife of a priest, right? So she is in a much more wealthy status, a much more powerful social position than Mary. Mary is unwed. She doesn't, in the way Luke describes her, doesn't seem to have any social status really, right? Her social status is in her betrothal to a son of David, right? And then, but what she does have is she has fertility. She's able to have a child. And Elizabeth, the way that Elizabeth treats Mary is to honor Mary. Elizabeth gives the honor to Mary and recognizes that what Mary's doing is even more significant, right? That she says, you are blessed among women, right? So the way that Elizabeth sort of comes down off of her pedestal, right? In reality, the social hierarchy would be that Mary's coming to bless Elizabeth, for she's finally become pregnant in her old age and she's the wife of the priest. Mary's just a nobody from Nazareth, right? But she flips the script, right? Mary is suddenly somebody. She is the mother of the Lord. And it's like this parallel story to Hagar and Sarah, where Sarah was struggling, right? Sarah had the social privilege over Hagar, yet she couldn't see Hagar as a person. She couldn't meet her there. She couldn't honor her. And so like these parallel stories of the barren woman and the fertile woman give us it's like a healing moment. It is the peace of this Advent Sunday, right? It is where we see what peace can look like, what reconciliation can look like. That in the Mary and Elizabeth story, which is really tied to the Magnificat, which comes after this, which is then tied to the birth of Jesus, right? All these things, we see this sort of wholeness, this coming back together that's drawn in these stories. And I think, again, for me, that's the heart of Christmas. That's keeping Christ in Christmas, restoring wholeness, making peace where there's a lack of peace, and recognizing, again, it's Elizabeth who honors Mary, right? It's the person with more power and privilege that has to give over, right? That has to stand in solidarity. I think that's the tricky thing, especially coming from the world of whiteness, right? That there's this myth of equality. Well, everybody's equal. So like there's this anger, right? Well, particularly towards marginalized people groups, right? Like, well, they need to be this way, right? There's sort of this expectation on the marginalized people groups. And the reality is, like, yes, we could talk about those, but I think it has to start with the people with the power, right? It's a different position, it's the Elizabeths who need to honor, it's the Sarahs who need to honor, to see the humanity of the lowly and lift them up.
I'll take that as, I think that's a collective challenge for all of us this Christmas, to take whatever privilege we have in whatever way it shows up and see the sacredness, the divinity, the wonder that is present in our fellow human being and fellow creation, even those outside of humanity, right? Like, so even our fur babies at home, finding some divinity in them and acknowledging that, because even they get lost in the story of Christmas. But there's no way they were in a barn and wildlife was not present, you know what I mean? So, or at least domesticated animals. So even they have a place. And I think what you're calling us to is to be able to pause and find the divine in all things in this story. And I think at the end of the day, that really is what keeping Christ in Christmas is all about. Now, most conservatives would hear that and they'd probably lose their shit, because they're thinking, I wasn't thinking about animals when I was talking about keeping the Christ in Christmas. But you give it to us liberals and look what happens.
Look at what happens. I'm wondering if it might be a good idea to read the Magnificat to make sure that folks who don't necessarily have those verses stuck in their head as like, yes, this is part of what the story says. Things are flipping upside down. And so I'd love to read it from Reverend Wilda C. Gaffney, PhD, in her A Women's Lectionary for the Whole Church. My soul magnifies the Holy One, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. For God has looked with favor on the lowliness of God's own womb slave. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is God's name. God's loving kindness is for those who fear God from generation to generation. God has shown the strength of God's arms. God has scattered the arrogant in the intent of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. God has helped God's own child, Israel, a memorial to God's mercy, just as God said to our mothers and fathers and parents, just to Hagar and Sarah and Abraham, to their descendants forever. Forever and ever, amen.
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 Word of God for the people of God.
Thank you to God.
It is around the hour mark, and I think that was a lovely ending. But I wonder if anyone wants to say any final words as we close. Any final thoughts?
May you be able to remember forward as well, and may you see the glimmers of the hope of the Magnificat and of the wildlife and God meeting us in the shit and the muck, and of God showing up and living among us.
Amen.
Amen to that.
Yeah, I got nothing else besides amen.
Well, may it be so. Thank you all.